and a very beautiful community. Let me know straight away if you can see me and hear me with a KH. And if you can see and hear me with a KH, we're going to proceed. And we're going to proceed as we always do. And that's by honoring, as is an important tradition of ours, every single question at the top. I think it's sometimes tricky for some of you guys to get the right kind of access. You have a question, you've been meaning to ask, it just doesn't come up and doesn't come up the opportunity. And that's why I'm so far quite enthused about this idea that on our lives, we try to take up virtually every single question that's left there before. So it's a good opportunity to connect. And let me just say that I am on 13 hours of sleep out of the last 6 days. So we're going to last only an hour today. And I can see there are a lot of questions upstairs. So we're going to start with them. And then we're going to see, beautiful community, how we go. So let's rock and roll upstairs. Is there a liberal left in UK politics? Otago is asking. Everyone seems so authoritarian these days. Have I missed them? Does our current political climate preclude them being visible? My teacher from my postgrad period at Oxford, philosopher Alan Ryan, wrote a piece once over 30 years ago, comparing the third way, Tony Blair's new Labour project, with the 1906 Henry Campbell Bannerman government. And one of the things that made me skeptical about that comparison is the centralizing urge in New Labour. There was something, for better or worse, could be for better in some ways, illiberal in there. But what I'd say is make a distinction today between authoritarian instincts that are constitutional and institutional, a kind of overreach, right? So an example might be the police getting overly interested in somebody who said something on social media. But distinguish between that and the kind of authoritarianism that looks to smash institutions. So don't put it all into the same pot. It's wrong to put into the same pot the authoritarianism of Boris Johnson and the authoritarianism of Keir Starmer. Because however authoritarian Keir might or might not be, he is constitutional. He wants to be checked and balanced by institutions and constitutions, and Bojo doesn't. So having made this distinction, yes, there could be some space for more intransigently confident liberal politics. And maybe you could then ask some questions about where the Liberal Democrat Party is in the UK. And the answer to that question is they have chosen recently a politics of incremental victories by constituency. So that's undermined their capacity to come up with a national message. Enough. Lottie Lane. Vlad, is 5% of GDP a necessary spend, in your view, given your stated repercussions on welfare spending? I'm not a military expert, and obviously a lot of that spend is not directly military at all, in fact. How you do it is much more important than how much you invest in it. You can go around investing in a questionable way. I mean, for instance, there has been a lot of critique of the recent UK enterprise of trying to get F-35s with the nuclear carrying capacity. And people have questioned that because you're going to be dependent on the whims of a declining empire. So there's plenty of ways to do this right. There's plenty of ways to do this wrong. When you do it, you have to absolutely consider issues of democratic decline in your country and repercussions for underfunding for other public goods, underfunding for which does undermine trust. You also have to consider global dynamics, and you also have to consider how much of that funding can reasonably be made into projects that make you medium term dependent on an increasingly unpredictable United States. So don't look at the numbers. If we fall far short of the numbers, that's interesting. But even countries that might be doing well in terms of the numbers aren't necessarily doing well objectively, because it depends on how the money is spent. Whoa, Morik is saying, Bill Browder claims that Putin struck a deal taking 50% of oligarchs' profit in exchange for letting them keep their wealth. What happens to this arrangement when Putin is no longer in power? Well, I won't comment on Bill's specific claim there, but I will say that Putin is a guarantor of these people's access and wealth and privilege. And when you remove him, it's not clear what's left of their resources. And Putin is too weak to have a transition process which he controls. Once the transition process, already in motion in my view to some degree, but once a transition into post-Putin Russia accelerates, Putin will not be able to control it. So therefore, you're very concerned about what's going to happen to you post-Putin if you are Putin's inner circle. And that, quite frankly, is one of the central preoccupying concerns of the regime today. Lou B is asking, it strikes me how similar Putin's defensive border expansion is to Netanyahu's, at least on the surface. Similar internal motives. Yes, internal motives are quite central in what Netanyahu has done in Gaza, and they were also quite central in the recent attacks on Iran. There is no universalizable sort of principled, stable connection between foreign escalation, hello Rachel, foreign escalation and regime security. But a very good way to acquire greater regime security is to engage in various kinds of adventures outside your borders. So we said a little bit about it last time. I won't say much more, but is there a regime security overlap in the motivations of Putin and Netanyahu? Yes, to a very large extent. Almost enlightened. Did your identity change the more time you spent in the UK? I'm also from a matrilineal minority, grew up in a post-communist state, moved to an EU state, but I still don't feel belonging. Well, my identity didn't change when I moved in 1990 to Israel and left the USSR, and then in 1994 when I left Israel for the UK. It evolved. I had a proclivity to be intensely individual in my development. So I would have always had a predilection for a degree of apartness from my cultural milieu. At the same time, there is also the fact of the age. I was 9 when I left the Soviet Union. So if you put me into a Russian environment now, I'll be able to understand and not just linguistically, but understand culturally deeply what people are thinking and feeling and saying, but I'll feel completely alien in that culture. In the same way that I'll feel less alien, but still alien with Ukrainians. Alien, not in a negative sense, in the sense that there's a cultural gap. Now, this is made worse in the case of Russia because Russian culture is particularly pathological at this point. It's particularly unhealthy. But so there is no sense of me being a Russian fitting in the West. I mean, Russian is extremely culturally alien to me, much more alien than, I don't know, being Spanish or Italian or German. It's just that I have a deep internal understanding, and it does shape my identity in a certain kind of way, but at quite a high level of resolution. What do I feel now? I feel fundamentally European, by which I mean West European. So I'm a bit more at home in Hungary and Czech than I am in Poland, for example, and probably more at home in Poland than in Ukraine. So I'm more West European. I'm more North European than South European, even though there's so much about Italy that I greatly admire, for instance, and Greece. And I suppose there is a certain sense in which I'm British, but that feels very much secondary. Isaiah Berlin, my hero, used to say that for him, Europe went from New York to Budapest. And that's rather how I feel. I mean, when I'm in London right now, I don't feel that I am, despite Brexit, I don't feel like I am in a situation where this is the capital of the country. I mean, I feel that this is a city in a country in which Lyon and Munich are also cities. So that's really how I feel about it, as much as it doesn't map onto especially post-Brexit politics. Are you at home in current Hungary, Rachel is asking. Politically, of course, no, but I'm making a cultural distinction that's there whether you have Orban or not. What would a non-technocratic form of centrism look like? And is there such a thing? Is it even conceivable? So I don't have an objection to a defense of centrism. I don't think of myself as, I know you know, Rachel. I am slow. I think that I don't have an objection to a defense of centrism. I don't make one myself, because I think that the constructive politics that I would recommend today in the West will not be centrist. It'll be a sort of ill-assorted mix of stuff from all over the place. The only thing it'll have in common is it'll be constitutional. But I would recommend, for instance, quite a tough immigration policy, a policy that I'm not comfortable with personally at all. It goes against my values. But I'd recommend it politically. I'd recommend more a center-right than a center-left immigration policy. Because what will happen is that a center-left immigration policy today will lead to a hard-right immigration policy tomorrow. That's just the reality we're in. I'd recommend a very strong degree of economic populism, of the kind that's to the left of Joe Biden. And I'd continue making recommendations that come from all over the place. The things that will be difficult to square will be, how do you balance populism, which you need to some degree, with commitment to institutions? So we'll be threading sort of 17 qualities that an ideal political candidate will have through a needle. It's going to be very difficult, because they're going to be qualities that are typically not combined. And that's why that porridge I'm not comfortable to call centrism. But if you want to call your porridge centrism, I'm fine with that, as long as we realize that there is a certain species of centrism, which I call technocratic centrism, which has come to be out of touch with the sentiments of citizens on the doorstep and needs change. So that's my answer. We're in a very difficult situation where almost any kind of politics you offer will undermine trust, left or right. So you need to offer a politics that minimally undermines trust, and it's gonna come from a very big pool of possibilities, and it's gonna look like a very weird kind of salad. Sushishni is saying, we're talking about effective politics and how institutions should address real issues for citizens and not be left out. And this concerns especially the younger generation the most, since they're the most EU skeptical. Currently, this younger audience is trying to pass a pro-consumer initiative through the EU Parliament to preserve video games from being destroyed. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this. And I do think if those people saw that this initiative was taken seriously by the institutions, it would, however, little improve the general attitude towards the EU and help preserve democracy. The initiative is called Stop Killing Games. I can't say anything about this, but in broad brushstrokes, any demonstration of cause and effect that citizens can witness, whereby they've done something, and then they're seeing social consequence, constructive social consequences, anything like that is very important. Because the thing that's really, really scary is that citizens are here, they are pressing buttons, and nothing happens. So I'm pressing the button K here, and there is no K on my screen. Okay, I scramble, I press more buttons, and no letters are appearing on my screen. That's how people feel about politics. It's the sense that you can't inflect the political process no matter what you do. So this kind of feedback mechanism is in principle very, very important. Vlad, do you think there's a parallel between Weimar Germany and post-Cold War Russia? Yes, there is. And the historical love-hate relationship with the West. And that also suggests that a post-Putin Russia could be integrated into Europe. There are certainly elements of a Weimar syndrome in Russia. There are also differences. But here you have to understand a very important context. What happened in Germany in the middle of the 20th century was a distortion, but nevertheless a distortion of very important European traditions and very important German traditions. Hitler is as German as Goethe, and Putin is as Russian as Dostoevsky. So the Romantic movement's notion of self-realization through the application of willpower is a very important cultural notion for us. It's both the central animating notion behind our societies, because the value of authenticity is the most important value in our societies, and it's a central animating notion of the Nazi movement. It's just, as it were, a tree with very, very, very different branches, and some branches are constructive, and some branches are absolutely cataclysmically, murderously unconstructive. That's where you get this extraordinary idea that the will, the will of a single individual can express the collective self-realization of an entire culture. The idea of societal transformation through technology, right? Relatedly to the authentic self-realization story, various kinds of love of country and nationalism. So you can tell a very big story about how what appeared there is really horrific, but it's European. Russia's difficulty is that Russia's high culture is completely European, but Russia's culture in general is less European. And that's a very important point to make, and that would be one of the things that you have to put on the table if you have the kind of conversation you want to have. That's one disanalogy between Germany and Russia. I think that another point worth making is that there is a good question about how far you want a cultural explanation of Putinism that ties it to Russian things, and how far you want a sociological explanation of Putinism that ties it to various kinds of global forces. In other words, is it part of the same phenomena that Trump got elected and Putin invaded Ukraine? I'm going to say it is. So you're also going to need to get clear about what kind of a thing Putinism is. Is it an extreme version of some kind of a global disease that we suffer from too? Or is it something more uniquely Russian? It's a bit of both, but it's more of the global disease than something uniquely Russian, although it's uniquely Russian too. The business of integration of Russia into Europe, I'm skeptical about. But what I would say is that inevitably any security proposals for the future of Europe have to obviously include Russia and reckon with the reality that Russia is going to be there. They can't sort of magically dream Russia out of the equation. This is literally just 2% of the conversation that we need to have in response to your important question. How, Mouse, do you have any thoughts on politicizing long COVID and ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, the two conditions I have, and how to address this to public and governments and possible benefits and pitfalls of this? And will there be a tipping point at some point? So this is actually not just a concern that's about my current health crisis, because we have the numbers. Numbers are bad. So we've really got, let's make the numbers up, but make them fairly accurate. We've got something like 1 in 200 humans globally have ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, and perhaps the same number has long COVID of a profoundly disabling sort. Long COVID is a vascular disease. It's a disease that attacks your microvasculature. Now, because the numbers are so big, it's not just that we've got exclusion, we've got all these people suffering, but yeah, 1 in 200, but for ME, if not more. It was 1 in 250 about 20, 30 years ago. But the rate of people getting sick brings it up because the rate of recovery is about 5%. So people who get ill tend to be ill if they're still alive 30 years later. The economic losses are cataclysmic. I mean, we're really talking tens of billions annually in the United States. And we might even get into the tens of billions in the UK because the numbers are so big. What do I think needs to happen? This is, as your favorite YouTuber Jordan Peterson would say, multifactorial. Now, one thread here is that you have to pick a constructive target. And the constructive target is the psychiatric takeover of these conditions. Thank you so much, sweetheart. Got my little sisters looking after me because I can't get up, so I need full-time care. So I've got my little sister who has brought me, I think, a Red Bush tea with coconut milk. So I think that, and I had my partner earlier here today, so it's like a rotation. So the first thing you've got to do is say, look, the World Health Organization calls me a neurological disease in the 60s. Why did some psychiatrists try to take over the disease in the 80s and pretend that it was psychological? It was psychological in a complex way to do with something called the biopsychosocial model of disease. A model that I don't find just fails to apply to me. I find that it's um, I find that it's I find that it's incoherent in itself. Actually, there's no philosophical account of it. Joma, Vlad is partnered. I'm crushed. I'll be offering therapy for members of the community who are crushed by such realities. Just drop me an email and get in touch with Vlad. So you got to make it clear exactly what on earth happened in the 80s and why these psychiatrists got involved and why have they since been chased out mostly, but are still not chased out in Denmark and in the UK and a couple of other countries. Even though there's now really, well over 10,000 peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals establishing the biomedical basis of ME. One of the problems has been that the psychiatrists have taken people without ME, given them interventions that might help them, and then claimed that that's a success for ME patients. But guys, you never had patients with ME to begin with. So there's many, many problems like this. But what you need to do is tell a journalistic story about the malignancy and almost conspiracy nature of that takeover, the way you do with the climate crisis and the fossil fuel industry in the 80s. Speaking of partners, my partner made a film called Big Oil versus the World. That was on BBC and PBS. And that's an investigation of the misconduct of the fossil fuel industry in the 80s when they full well knew what the truth was and they tried to muzzle it. So we need a story like that that really exposes this whole bit of history. And until we have that, anybody who talks about it looks like a weirdo, because when you're dealing with something that's so unlovely, you sound like a conspiracy theorist. But actually, if there is a really very dodgy kind of sort of cross-disciplinary but illegitimate takeover attempt that's not supported by the biomedical evidence, well, you need to actually reveal that properly so that you don't sound like a loon when you talk about it. And to not sound like a loon, you need very serious journalistic investigative work to reveal that recent history. That's one thing you need. Second thing you need is obviously political will, and that helps when politicians talk about it. The third thing you need is journalistic responsibility around how to report around these conditions. Too often, when people report around, let's say, long COVID, which I didn't have until 8-9 months ago, they just put up a picture of somebody who's tired in bed. Well, I'm not tired. My microvessels are broken, and I can't stand because of that. And I'm neither fatigued nor melancholy. My mental health is extraordinary. It's better than the mental health of any of the doctors who treated me when I was in the hospital for a month. So let's get this right journalistically and do the work. This is actually better in the United States than it is in the UK. In the United States, if you're writing a piece for the Washington Post about health policy or for the New York Times, you tend to do a bit of research. In the UK, very often you don't. The state of medical journalism in the UK is diabolical. It's literally like, I'm Barry and I write for one broadsheet newspaper, and I have a friend called Harry, he's a GP, and I'll call him, Harry, there's a new condition I need to write about. Can you come for lunch with me and tell me what you think about it? No, what Harry thinks about is irrelevant. What science says about it is what's relevant. And then you need quite a bit of a realization that institutionally, medicine is designed to ignore chronic illness as it stands. And I'll talk more about that in detail another time. Enough. Daniel, Vlad, curious to know your opinion on Stephen Kotkin's work and his perspective on the current Russian regime. And M. Morris says, that's a great question regarding Kotkin. I'd love to see a broader exploration of Kotkin's responsibilities or perhaps failures as an historian. Well, there's no reason why I can't have Steve Kotkin on the channel. So maybe we could do that. But he is a professional historian of very high caliber. I'm a professional philosopher who is semi-functioning, to put it politely. I'm more functioning as a public intellectual at this point. So it's hard to compare our perspectives because we talk and think about the world in a complementary but different way. What I would say is that if you are a great fan of Kotkin, which I think is a good thing to be, you're going to find some differences. What could they be? Possibly one would be that I'd insist on Putin as being less continuous with Soviet authoritarianism and with the Cold War, and more a species of a kind of a radicalism that to a great extent comes from elsewhere. So the discontinuity of what's happening in Russia now from the calamities that happened in Russia in the Soviet Union in the 20th century, that's one thing that I think perhaps I'd emphasize in a different way. There's too much to say, so I'll just give you that one thing. Can you offer some guidance on conversing constructively with friends who are intelligent but have totally bought into the right-wing populist rhetoric and refuse to see any other perspective? This question often comes up. My answer is always inadequate, but it is basically intimacy first, 4 coins into the intimacy coin box, and only 1 coin into the debating political differences box. So if arguing about politics takes up more than 50% of the emotional energy of the relationship, that argument will fail. So you need to have a positive basis, otherwise you don't go there. Just like if you're a busy couple, about to send your kids to school at 7:30 in the morning, you don't want to raise an important relationship challenge to discuss at that point. Even if the challenge is real and you do need to discuss it, there's no space for it. So in a relationship where you don't have a considerable degree of intimacy, there's no space to debate these differences. Reason is and always will be a slave of the passions, says the great David Hume. And what Hume means by that is not something I can immediately convey, but very roughly, he means by that what the contemporary philosopher Bernard Williams framed as the notion that you're only motivated by what you're motivated by. If I'm trying to persuade you, but I don't appeal to what is already part of your motivational set, I'm not going to persuade you. And in fact, Bernard Williams would go further. He would actually argue that unless there are materials in your motivational set that push you toward doing something, you have no reason to do it. That's not the same as saying you shouldn't do it, but nevertheless, we're in this important tradition that gets absolutely right the fact that the reason does not have its own social power. A good argument will very often fail to convince. A bad argument convinces easily. So you've got to be serious about the internality of human motivation. And you've got to be serious about intimacy. So these are two pillars you bring into this conversation. And then my trick that I always recommend is don't debate people to, try to persuade them of a different view, but rather discuss things with them so as to understand what they mean. So do you mean that Trump has a responsible relationship with institutions? Yes, I don't. Yes, I do. Okay, interesting. Tell me more about that. Or they might say, well, no, I don't, but I think we actually need to wreck the institutions because they've become so corrupt. Okay. Do you think that you need to wreck the institutions constructively, or can vandalism do? Um, Maybe you don't think it's just vandalism, you think it's constructive. Tell me the 7 most constructive things about what Trump is doing and so on. And the aim here is, yes, to challenge, but fundamentally to come away with a capacity to reconstruct what the other person is saying, even if you find it ludicrous. Your aspiration should be to try to reconstruct what they say. But then there's another layer. You're not doing that like a, you know, undergraduate in philosophy to reconstruct their propositional claims. You're doing that to understand what they feel behind the arguments they make. So it might be, okay, they think that political hooliganism is essential because our institutions won't be broken by any other means and they need to be broken. But also, behind that, they have emotions of distrust of various kinds, powerlessness, right? Exclusion, um, unsafety, betrayal, sense of opacity, and so on. Robert Forbes, I believe we're going to go through this period of historical normalcy far quicker than we have before due to living in the most complex and interconnected social system ever. Thoughts? Time is moving faster, right? Social change and technological change will be faster for us than for other human beings. So if that's what you're talking about, then you're right. At the same time, there are certain patterns and there are certain tendencies that hold in history and will hold for the next 10, 20 years. Null simplex. You say we need to encourage nationalism in our politics if we're to save our democracies. How do I engender nationalism in others when I feel so little pride in my country or her citizens? Well, a very important source of patriotism, or what you could call civic nationalism, is pride in your work, feeling a sense of dignity in your work. Um, Another way into it is to speak about our problems, not in terms of your country being broken, but in terms of your country being great and it being too great to have the kind of problems that it has, right? Um, Virtually any constructive critique of current politics in the United States, let's say, can take the form, we're America and we're better than this. I'll talk more about this because this is an incredibly important point. This is an incredibly important point because there are some people on the left who think you can do without patriotism, and you can't. I mean, you can't even have a serious policy conversation about an important issue unless it is partly driven by a patriotic sense of what you, as Canadians, as Brits, as Americans, are. Okay, let's say that we've now caught up with everybody. Um, You said that the militarization, Hussein is asking, of the Russian economy is going to continue after the war. Can you elaborate, including definitions? The military-industrial complex will keep pumping. What we need to ascertain is just whether it'll be with the name of partaking in another war, or in the name of partaking in some kind of escalation short of that. So we'll talk about potential post-war scenarios. I would turn the question around. What would it mean for, how would Putin demilitarize the economy if he stops the war in November? It's impossible. Many of the things that are set in motion are set in motion on a time frame of more than just years. The biggest question is rather not about the militarization of the economy, but about how much public support for that, public apathy about that, public alienation from that there's going to be in the country. How Putin will continue balancing the politicization and depoliticization of his population. Mark Galeotti did 2 podcasts about what would happen if Putin stopped the war. Have a pop at them, because Mark would have been good and he would have taken, I listened to one of them. Mark would have taken 45 minutes to walk through these issues. Chester Wusher. As a teacher, I've noticed politics entering the classroom more overtly, at younger grades more and more. Interesting. What should I do when my own students overtly oppose my and others' human rights? I'm gay, by the way. Well, most rights you have as a gay person are not human rights. They're just rights. Some of them don't clash with the rights of others. Some of them would. Let's say some kind of Muslim school didn't want to hire gay teachers and so on. There'd be a conflict of rights there. I have a very simple answer, I'm afraid. And that is that when it comes to discrimination against groups that is not notional but fairly clear, you have to stand up and draw a very clear line. And while I would normally recommend you not be political with kids, on something like this, my recommendation would be to be very clear and open and transparent. Little Harry here down the corridor has been caught up with parents who are in the YouTube algorithm, or is themselves in the YouTube algorithm of an unlovely kind, and they're questioning whether it's okay to be gay. Let me tell you, it's okay. It's really, really okay. And it's okay to have a gay prime minister and president, and it's okay to have a woman prime minister and president. And if you're going to challenge that, no way. We're going to yield an inch to that perspective. So, when it comes to specific discrimination, not sort of postmodern bullshit about, capitalist power dynamics yielding discriminatory dispositions toward minorities, in the minds of white men. You can actually frame an argument like that legitimately, but most arguments of that form are bullshit. And that's not because, as I said, you can't frame an argument well that way. It's because most arguments of that form in our culture tend to take the form of hyper-identity politics and various kinds of postmodern sloppiness that confuses concepts that aren't social construct with social constructs and blah 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 blah. And makes activism out of history as well. But yeah, I'm sorry. Any attempt to trample on the rights of women or the rights of gay people, zero tolerance for that. Just no and no. And that's what we need to be very clear about. As hyper-identity politics, what some people unconstructively, critically call woke, I call it woke too. Woke is gone. It's not gone yet, but it's on the way out of the door. And what's very important is that we urgently reframe a very passionate, progressive case for the rights of minorities of all kinds. So it's very important that just because the woke argument didn't do very well, it was largely counterproductive, leads to people like Trump coming to power, in fact. But what we need to do is immediately rescue the rights of unseen and disadvantaged groups from the woke discourse and push ahead. Because what's happening right now is that as woke's falling off the ledge, the authoritarian right perspective that there is nothing interesting about the rights of these groups anyway is coming to be dominant. And you have to push back very hard against that, but not do so in a hyper-identity politics kind of way. So my answer actually is zero negotiation here. If you want to exclude somebody because of their ethnic background or because of their sexual orientation, zero tolerance for your perspective. Tolerance for you, but zero tolerance for your perspective in the sense that, not in the sense that we're going to exclude your cancel, but in the sense that we're going to challenge you outright and say, no way, Jose, this is not happening. We're not debating, we're not compromising on this. But you've got to do that without the baggage of all of the hyper-identity politics nonsense that has been recently generated. Rachel, I don't know who that is. I should, I'm sure, but I don't. So I don't follow their work in Ukraine. What's your theory on consciousness? I think I did a video on the philosophy channel about that. And what are your thoughts on Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism, if you know it? I think Bernardo and I are a tiny bit in touch. I think there'd be quite a bit of overlap in what we think. My view, roughly, is that I'm not persuaded that we would need that concept. So that means that talk about how science will discover consciousness is absolutely ludicrous to me. It's just like in the realm of comedy. I'm open to consciousness becoming a concept that comes to be useful. I don't see that it is now. In other words, everything that we can say in terms of that concept, we can say as well or better in terms of other concepts. And by the way, the same passion I have for not yielding an inch on sexual orientation, not yielding an inch on ethnic background, also goes for neurodiversity. So if you're in my presence, it's hard to because I don't go out at the moment, but if you're in my presence and you're discriminating in the workplace inappropriately against somebody with ADHD or autism, I have zero room to negotiate with you. It's just a flat no. Just a flat no. So the same kind of non-negotiation about the very basic things owed to disadvantaged folks because of sexual orientation, because of ethnicity, applies also to neurodiverse folks. I don't give a crap if you are 80 years old and you're a CEO and you've never heard of ADHD. and a couple of people on your staff really need appropriate accommodations, you're giving them these accommodations. There's no negotiation. So, and that's the problem with the whole spiel, right? Of this, woke and anti-woke culture wars. So many issues get distorted there because people who don't know much about this sort of stuff might assume that ADHD or autism or ADHD are some kind of expressions of identity that are a sign of late stage Western decline. No, this stuff is real. Adam, thank you so much. Adam Ragusi in the house. Adam, I've said this before, Adam is as good as any writer on YouTube that I know in any niche. Beautiful writer. Hi, Vlad, old mate, says, what does the outlook for Germany look like in the context of democratic decline, repeating sins of the past? The forces we're facing are global. In fact, at the top, there may have been a question about this that I missed. Let me see if I missed it. Maybe I missed it. But basically, which are the countries that are doing better with democratic decline? And you could say, well, maybe Denmark, maybe Switzerland. The reality is that the countries that are doing better are not typically the countries which have the best solutions. They're just the countries that are the least afflicted because they have a degree of institutional stability, historical stability, and a degree of homogeneity. So how is Germany doing with authoritarian, anti-democratic populism? Badly. Badly. That does not mean you're going to have a return, however, to the 30s. We're not going there. We're going somewhere else. We're going toward a partly fascistized politics, but it won't be that. It'll have its own shape, about which we will talk in more detail. Moon Regolith says, I feel things may fall apart here more than anyone has imagined. I feel stuck. How does one know if they're actually in their era's version of 1939? Look, the whiff of the 30s is in the air because all kinds of irresponsible political actors are circling power. And you have a project right now in Trumpism that has elements of soft coup. But I don't think we are going back to the 30s. We're going toward an exclusionary, identitarian, centering white identity, type of electoral monarchism with elements of democracy and elements of authoritarianism. That's where we're drifting roughly in the collective West, if there is such a thing as the collective West. But it's not going to be either Germany or Italy from the 30s. Gaffer Bob, thank you back. Toasted Cuisine, thank you back. What is your theory of consciousness? That we've done. Rachel, can Ukraine do better at communicating with the global South? Yes, because just like there's an imperial prejudice that Russia has toward Ukraine, on a much lesser level, Ukraine has an imperial prejudice toward countries we call the global South, and that often leads to under consideration and under engagement of the benefits of interdependence with these countries. And also the benefits of making a strong case to these countries, but just ignoring them as being non-Western and therefore reactionary. Modular Pelican, if evidence of election fraud existed, how could we navigate the ethics and risks of speaking up given existing distrust in recent election history? Feels like a catch-22. What I think you do need is the receipts. In this culture of radical distrust, you don't say that cheating occurred in an election if you're 60% certain. You need the receipts. So don't start speaking as you're gathering the receipts. Gather the receipts, and when you have the receipts, you don't compromise, and you just insist that the truth has to be known. If you lived under a dictator, who would you rather live under, the Austrian painter or Stalin's Russia? There are mitigated catastrophes, but for a large segment of the population in Nazi Germany, the ethical culpability is greater than for the Soviet population because they were relatively protected from the whims of the regime. Whereas in the Soviet Union, nobody was protected. Literally nobody. There's no class you could belong to that would make you fairly immune from being taken away in the middle of the night. And that makes the appalling behavior that citizens engaged in the Soviet Union absolutely appalling, but more understandable on the basis of self-preservation. That is not as clearly the case in the Austrian painter's country when he was in power. There are many, many differences. It's very tempting to say that they are both repulsive in incommensurable ways. What do I think of modern Marxists saying that Soviet communism isn't real communism and isn't Marxist? There are three relations between Marxist texts and then via Lenin's texts, Soviet practice. Three possible relations. One's a relation of continuity. You say that the Soviet experiment is an implementation of Marx's ideas. The second thing you say is that it obviously isn't an implementation, but there are some significant continuities, meaning that when Lenin refined Marxism in various ways, he wasn't just imposing random stuff onto it, he was doing things that were partly continuous with the spirit of the thing. And the third claim you make, the third position, is that the two have nothing to do with each other at all. And I think the truth is going to be found in the second one, in the middle. Obviously, Marx is not in any way ethically culpable for what happened in the 20th century. Or if he is, it's at a very great remove. There's something very ironic about Marx, of course, because Marx tried to deny the social power of ideas, and the most socially powerful idea of the 20th century was Marxism. But I think what you would say is that some of what's wrong with some of Marx's texts is meaningfully related to some of what went very wrong with the Soviet experiment. And that's why I call it an experiment in Western utopia, as John Gray does as well, because it genuinely is an attempt to enact a certain political tradition of a West European kind in practice in Eastern Europe. If you pushed me, I'd probably say that the continuities are ones that lean more in the direction of Marx not being related to Soviet practice, then in the direction of Marx being literally, a source of ideas that simply got implemented, but literally that there's a very direct continuity. I think that's very implausible. So it's a bit of both claim would probably lean toward it's not that continuous with Marxism than toward it's completely continuous, but it is of course partly continuous. And so these are the three pillars between which you're going to have to pick a position. I strongly recommend you pick the middle position, and then we go on from there with our conversation. And perhaps we will have that conversation in detail. I haven't read Marx closely for 25 years, but I have read Marx closely, and so I'd be capable of talking about him in detail. One of the greatest social thinkers in the history of the West. If you were an advisor to Iran, what would you advise them to do? Outside my range of expertise, the first thing you'd start with is the extraordinary weakness of Iran's current position. There's not that much they can do. And they have to do their best to, sustain regime security. We've gone over the hour, but we're just going to go a little bit more. Do you think it's likely that the US will enter a civil war or a Soviet-style collapse? I don't think that you're talking about a major civil war realistically, but there are different kinds of civil war. And in some senses, the United States already is experiencing a civil war. It just depends what you mean by that. I think the most realistic scenario is that there will be very considerable unrest if Trump, and the more Trump tries to break institutions, or his followers do. But I think the most likely scenario for the United States is that it's still a fairly functional but progressively illiberal superpower. That's where things are going. So I don't think we're looking at a kind of collapse. We're certainly not looking at a collapse of an economic system. But the trend is clearly negative. The risk of social unrest is considerable. But the most likely scenario is simply a scenario where institutions get asphyxiated and you have an elite that's hard to dislodge from power. Hey Vlad, too much mushrooms. You might have talked about this before, but what are your thoughts on a post-Putin Russia? Do you think there'd be another person who will be the same? I think that it's not much about persons, even though individuals do decide history to a great extent. It's about whether Russia basically manages to federalize, to decentralize, and do so while retaining a sense of what holds this whole territory together, and without that territory beginning to fragment. That's the process that we're going to be witnessing. You seem to be against the US military intervention in Iran. What's the right way to deal with the regime that has an apocalyptic ideology? You bring it about that they are as far removed as they can be from developing their nuclear program. Trump's actions are not the best way of bringing about that outcome. Moreover, you cannot isolate how you conduct yourself in a single conflict scenario from other conflict scenarios. When Trump bombs Iran, Putin is in love with that. And the Chinese are in love with it. They don't like it in many, many respects, but they're in love with it at the level of it dramatically increasing the perceived legitimacy of their own foreign misadventures. So you can't disconnect the two. And that's been one of the difficulties for the West. That the West has not played by its own rules. And then it's very difficult to complain that various tyrants around the world aren't playing by the same rules. However, that's not the only thing to say. The other thing to say is that Trump did not make a decision to bomb Iran. He had no clue what he was doing. And he got bullied into a decision by initially Netanyahu, and then the carousel of conversations in his circle. It pushed him in different directions. And this is where he eventually landed. But this is not a serious policy decision. This is impulsive, reckless, self-serving politics. So what Trump did will go down as a success in terms of public reception. It does not help the United States. It does not help Israel. It does not help the global order. It does not help Ukraine. It does not help Taiwan. And it does not reduce the chances that Iran will have nuclear weapons. It might increase them. No thoughts on Nick Fuentes today? Because we're winding down. Let's take a couple of little questions and then we're going to be good. Question from Georgia. If the majority supports democracy but the regime is repressive, why is peaceful protest the only acceptable response? Well, first of all, you've got to make sure that it is the majority that supports democracy. Saying so doesn't prove it. You can make a strong case, but you need to make that case. And then the key question is, do you compete institutionally, even if the institutional game is rigged against you a bit? And the answer is yes, you do to the last moment. The Russian opposition evacuated institutional politics too early. Putin was theoretically chase-outable after 2 terms, in my view. It would have been very difficult, but doable. Number one. Number two, don't think that street politics is necessarily politics. Walking down the street can be expressive politics, but it doesn't have to be effective politics. So just standing in a square is not necessarily politically effective if there's 100,000 of you. And third, if you're going to take it beyond peaceful protest, the question is how you're going to do it constructively. That A, you're going to get a good outcome and it's going to be sustainable and so on. So it's easy to ask the question you're asking. The answers to it are very difficult. And it's a very tragic situation that Georgia is in. A very, very tragic situation. It's a situation Putin wants Ukraine to get into. It's a very difficult situation. And the real tragedy for Georgia is that the West is in retreat regionally and indeed globally. So it's ever harder to lean on the West and leverage that way against the Russians. It's hard. It's really hard for Georgia. The image there is that the pro-democracy civic base in Georgia are like reaching out for the West, but the West's hand is drifting away. Suzanne, thank you so much. Can one gain a great philosophical education from books alone? If you are a philosophical genius, then yes. Otherwise, no. You need systematic interaction with philosophical practitioners who are going to, basically teach you how to build a house. You want to put the foundation down first and so on. What are your thoughts on patriarchy in 2025, Vlad? Let's say we're going to take 2 more questions after this. I'm a feminist. I'm a non-woke feminist. That's to say that I don't use hyper-identity politics arguments to advocate for women's rights, but I advocate for women's rights. The problem we've got at the moment in our discourse is that the crisis of men, which is real, is making a lot of men in our culture ask, haven't women's rights gone far enough? But the trouble is that there's no connection between the two. Men's experience can be becoming more deleterious without it being the case that women's rights are advancing as well as they should be. Now, girls are flourishing in a way that boys are not in the Western education systems at the moment. There are many growing discrepancies and so on. But nevertheless, I still think there's an enormous degree of discrimination against women. And I think that it's very important to be aware of it. That's enough. I don't want to define the kind of feminist that I am too much. But do we have a big problem still? Yeah, we do. We have a lot of prejudice. A lot of prejudice. And as I say, the crisis of men is not a product of women's rights having gone too far. Don't buy that alt-right formulation. Oh, for goodness sake. Just to clarify, by non-woke, do you also mean anti-trans? No, I certainly don't mean anti-trans. I'm very passionate about trans people's rights, unlike the anti-woke, the majority of the anti-woke brigade, like Jordan Peterson. What I do, however, think is that you certainly don't do well advocating for trans rights via hyper-identity politics. That's to say, by taking political differences, moralizing them, taking moral differences, making them about identity, and taking identity differences and wanting institutions to inculcate them. That's not how you proceed. You constructively engage in a conflict of rights and try to win if you're a trans person. Right? Who do my rights clash with? Well, they are going to clash to some degree with rights of biological women. The idea that that clash couldn't occur is magical thinking, and it's apolitical. But in that clash, I'm going to try to win. Yeah? I want to have access to this and to that and to that, and I want to participate in this and in that and in this, and I'm going to make the case. I'm going to get us to make the case for me, and so on. I am absolutely non-woke, but pro-trans. And the sort of biographical criticism I have of the alt-right, anti-woke folks on when they talk about trans people is that anybody who is serious and anybody who is, as they might, put it, a proper solid man, really masculine, is going to see a disadvantaged group and immediately feel compassion for them and want to elevate them. Because I'm not a loser like some of these people. When I see trans people, I criticize some forms of trans advocacy and prefer others. And I might see many problems with some trans discourse, certainly. But my instinct is to say, if we're looking at legit trans people, elevate them, right? Make them feel like they're included, lift them up. That's the instinct of a grounded, confident, masculine person of the kind the populist right on the internet take themselves to be. But instead, they are phobic about a minority. So you have to piece all of this apart, as I've just briefly done. Okay, one more. I like the term politically awake. I think that's beautiful now. Okay, let's take the last question. Leonsky, to what extent is Trump thinking of using the military domestically to disrupt hold future elections? So the trend with Trumpian politics is that increasingly, like all other authoritarian populist right politics today, they're going to look for enemies within. And what's very important about this is that all of us might be sitting here and thinking, well, maybe in my case it's fine because I'm not an enemy. The thing about political projects like Trumpism is that they begin by very heavily relying on attacking a designated enemy within, but they keep that enemy fairly narrow. This will extend over time, whether under Trump or under some kind of inheritor of Trump's project, even though I argue that that would be somebody who would actually operate so differently that it wouldn't be Trumpism anymore. That'd be authoritarian in a less buffoonish way. But what we're going to see with Trump and after is an expansion of the notion of domestic enemy. And what's fascinating about history is that it teaches us that you can expand that concept so wide, it could literally encompass half of the population or more. So the politics of enemies within is constitutively part of this kind of political project. And that's why inevitably we're going to see more of it. And we have to be very, very careful that there is a kind of seepage that we'll keep seeing, whereby one category of people is picked on. You think, surely it has nothing to do with this other category, but then via a few steps, you get to the other category too, right? So non-citizens are picked for something, legal non-citizens. And you think, well, it's not going to affect citizens. Then citizens are picked on that thing a year later. So basically, it's bad news that you deal with, you tackle by understanding that what you should be freaking out about isn't just what's happening now, but what's going to happen a year or two from now. This is an escalating authoritarian cascade, and the category of enemies within is going to broaden, and we have to take on these a-holes who have no right to be so irresponsible with power. We have to take them on with the understanding that this is a very central tool of theirs, that whatever they want, they're going to have to expand over time. Joma is asking about healthy traits in philosophers, intellectuals, artists, with healthy masculine traits we could learn from. I'll say this. I'm going to have a special chat about the crisis of men, if not on the main channel, and certainly here. And at that point, I'll pick them out. But there are a few. Kowalczuk, I'm going to skip your question today, but maybe we could try it on the music channel. Everybody, thank you. You have done such a great job. We managed to get to 1 minute 20. Sorry if my answers were a bit fuzzy. I went for 85 hours on just 2 hours of sleep, and now I am on 13 hours in 6 days. So given that, I'm happy that some words came out of my mouth, and 48.2% of them made sense. Lots and lots of love and talk very soon. Bye-bye.